Kadangi turim svečiuose rašytoją ir mokslininką beje, Michaelo Brooksą. Ir iš tiesų Vilniaus knygų mugė yra toks renginys dabar jau tampantis ir platesnio masto, ne vien tik tai galbūt Lietuvoje žinomas, kiek aš girdėjau, iš tikrųjų jau apie jį daugiau žinoma yra. Ir vat kaip tik ta proga sutapo, kad išleista buvo visai neseniai knyga 13 protų nesuvokiamų dalykų. Tai mes labai džiaugiamės, kai Britų taryba pasiūlė galimybę Vilniaus universitete surengti Michaelo Brookso paskaitą. Ir galiausiai šiandien tas renginys ir vyksta. Ir aš tiesiog nenorėdamas labai čia laiko gaišinti ir ką nors pasakodamas, nes aš pats tą knygą, tiesiai pasakysiu, gavau Kalėdoms dovanų. Ir taip viskas, kai sutapo, kai man iš Britų tarybos parašė, o aš tą knygą buvau skaitęs ir galvoju, nu tiesiog kažkoks sutapimas, tas, kas kartais gyvenime būna, kaip žinot, kas nors su kuo nors sutampa, tai kartais visam gyvenimui tas lieka, kartais trumpiau, bet, žodžiu, tokie įvykiai tiesiog taip maloniai nustebino, kad taip gali įvykti viskas. Tai tikrai smagu turėti mums šiandien mūsų svečią. Labai trumpai prašysiu pakalbėti Britų tarybos Lietuvoje skyriaus vadovą gerbiamą Vasiliauską. Na ir paskiau knygos vertėjas, pasirodo, irgi yra taip, kad jis yra irgi man labai gerai žinoma žmogaus sūnus, o mano sūnus dar dirba su Miku kartu vienoje laboratorijoje. Tai tiek viskas persipinę buvo, kad aš kaip parašiau Mikui laišką, sakau, ar žinai, kad atvažiuoja Brooksas, sako, žinau, bet nieks man iki šiol nerašė. Sakau, aš pats tik šiandien ryte sužinojau, suderinam galutinai. Tai sako, nu suprantame, tada jis irgi pasakys porą žodžių apie tą knygą. Nu, po to paprašysim svečio, irgi sakiau, kad žmonės jauni nekantrus, neilgiau 45 minutės, kad šnekėtų, ką jis nori mums pasakyti. Tai prašau tada, Britų tarybos žodis.
Labas vakaras, noriu pasidžiaugti, kad mūsų bendradarbiavimas su Vilniaus universitetu tęsiasi ir būtent tęsiasi šitoje srityje, mokslo komunikacijos srityje, kuriai mes skiriame labai didelį dėmesį Lietuvoje ir ne vien Lietuvoje, o daugelį Europos šalių. Ir Michaelas jau šiandien apmokė apie 20 žurnalistų ir jaunųjų mokslininkų, kaip reikia rašyti mokslinius straipsnius populiarius į internetą, į spaudą ir panašiai. Ir noriu taip pat paraginti, jeigu čia esate kaip tikslių mokslo atstovai, dalyvauti šlovės laboratorijos konkurse. Šlovės laboratorijos projektas yra toks projektas, kuriame dalyvauja jauni mokslininkai, kurie pristato per 3 minutės savo idėją ir varžosi tarpusavį. Ir laimėtojas Lietuvos finalo vyksta į tarptautinį mokslo festivalį, mokslo komunikacijos festivalį Četelhame, Anglijoje. Ir ten taip pat varžosi kaip tokia Eurovizijoje 25 šalių, kas geriausiai pristatys per 3 minutės mokslo idėją. Taigi visa šita paskaita yra visiškai neatsitiktinumas, tai yra mūsų labai gilaus strateginio mąstymo rezultatas darbo, šiek tiek pasigirti. Taip pat noriu pagirti čia sėdinčią Danguolę Kiznienę, kur yra mūsų didžiausia fanė mokslo komunikacijos, jinai to užsiema mūsų biure ir noriu dabar užleisti žodį jau tikriem mokslininkam. Ačiū.
Okay, to prove that my translation of the book was not an accident, and I can speak English to some extent, I will do this in English. I would like to introduce Michaelo Brookso, tell you a couple more words about him, and this is a printout from his Wikipedia page. Well, because that's honestly more or less the only information available on the net. He hides himself pretty well. Well, he has a PhD from the University of Sussex in quantum physics. I tried to look up his work on the internet, couldn't find anything. Probably that's...
I can prove I found.
Yeah, okay, so I assumed he was writing his scientific papers under a different name, probably. But more importantly to us today, Michael is an excellent, and I'm not afraid of this word, writer about science to the broad public. And he has written to a number of newspapers and magazines, including The Guardian, The Independent, and above all, Playboy. And he is the the culprit of this excellent book that has been published in Lithuania. I came across it accidentally, just trying to figure out how to write about science so that even my grandfather and grandmother understands. And I think Michael is not only, a smart enough person with a degree in quantum physics to grasp the concepts behind modern cosmology, biology, medicine, and things like that, all of which you will find in the book, but also an expert on the human part of science. And I think this is his really strong point. He really likes to present science as a human activity, and with all the flaws and all the good things that are characteristic to us as humans. So without any further ado, Michael, you have the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introductions and for the invitations to come and speak here as well. I'm very conscious of this screen. Can I dare to move it? No, it just gets bigger. If that is possible, that would be great. Thank you. I am hopefully, over the next 45 minutes or so, really going to, I'm not going to talk about the contents of the book, although I will, point to it at the end. I wanted to take you on a journey. I was asked to talk about the issues of science and society and how we interconnect science with ordinary people and ordinary lives, and maybe where there are disconnects as well in that. So I'm going to do this talk called Will the Real Scientists Please Stand Up? Because what I'm going to do is actually talk about how the real scientists have tended to hide themselves away and assume a kind of disguise. And really, I think disguise needs to come off now. So the first question we have to ask ourselves, and this is an interesting question to ask, is what are scientists actually like? And if you talk to people in the street, they'll give you a response. If you talk to people at the university, especially in the science faculties, they'll give you a different kind of response, perhaps. But what's most interesting is to ask this question of elementary school children, so primary school children. And you say to the primary school children, okay, can you draw me a scientist? This is what you get. So when you do this test, and this is called the Draw a Scientist test. It's a recognized methodology and research in sociology. And it's been going for about 50 years now, 50, 60 years. It's been done in cultures across the world. And what you get from primary school children, when you ask them to draw a scientist, is almost always a man, so it's always male. There's always a white coat. There's usually pens in the pocket of the white coat. There are spectacles, there's balding issues, and quite often you get, you'll get facial hair as well. So if they do have hair, it's wild, crazy hair. But most of the time they're actually bald. And this is the child's perception of a scientist. And that's across cultures, and that's lasted for at least 50 years since we started doing this test. It's pretty universal. What's interesting is that if you then ask an adult the same question, draw me a scientist, you get this. Now, this was done in America, in Central Park, in fact. A group of people asked people to draw a scientist. And you got the crazy hair and the glasses, and in some of them you got lab coats. So the fact that it's in America means that no pants means no trousers. It's not no underwear, just to be clear on that. I have no idea why that is an issue here. But another interesting thing is, if you ask scientists also to draw a scientist, you get exactly the same thing. So scientists even have this self-perception of themselves as kind of, this strange stereotype of the crazy, lab-coated, bespectacled, wild-haired or no-hair scientist. You can't have ordinary hair. So you have to ask the question then, here's another thing. What are scientists like? We know what they look like now in the common perception. Here's another test that was done on primary school children. And they said, can you tell me, out of all these pictures, who are the scientists and who are not the scientists? And what the children said was, well, that man there on the bottom towards the right with the moustache, he's definitely not a scientist. Okay, they said that the woman second from the left on the bottom is not a scientist. The woman at the top on the second from the left is not a scientist. The man on the top right is not a scientist. The reason why they were asked, why do you say these people aren't scientists? And the children said, because those people are smiling, and scientists don't smile. And we have this extraordinary situation where we have children somehow who've imbibed this cultural reference where scientists are crazy-looking weirdos, almost always men, and they never have any fun, and they certainly don't smile. And I think this is a damaging stereotype of what scientists are actually like. I work with a lot of scientists, I visit scientist labs, I go to conferences, and I can tell you they do sometimes smile. I have seen it happen. So, what are we to make of this? What are scientists really like? And this is an important question, and it's a question that people don't really know the answer to, generally speaking. And I'm going to tell you a couple of stories of what scientists are really like, and some of the most interesting scientists that I've come across during times when I've been researching and writing. I'm going to apologize now, because all of these examples of slightly unorthodox behaviors and interesting scientists are men. And this has been pointed out to me. There's a good reason why there's no women on my list here, which I will go into later. Basically, it's that if you're a woman in science, it's still too hard to break the rules. It's not good for your career. So here's my first example. And I think this man has now become my favorite scientist of all time, pretty much. And hopefully you'll understand why in a few minutes. Werner Forssmann was a junior doctor in a hospital in Eberswald in Germany in the 1920s. He came across this diagram as happened to come across this drawing. And this drawing showed vets putting a catheter into the heart of a horse in order to introduce drugs into the horse's heart and also to perform diagnosis on heart problems. And at the time, nobody had ever touched the human heart, not a living human heart. It was absolutely off limits for all doctors and all medical researchers, because they felt, quite rightly perhaps, that if you started interfering with a live heart, you would interfere with the way it was beating and you could kill the patient. And so the heart was completely off limits. But when Forssmann saw this diagram, he thought, well, if you can do it to a horse, why can't you do it to a human being? So he went to his boss at the hospital and said, I would like to do an experiment where we introduce a catheter into the human heart. And his boss said, absolutely no way. You know, you're not doing that. It's completely off limits. We can't touch the human heart. And Forssmann said, well, why not? And he said, well, it could kill somebody, and then the hospital will be in terrible trouble. So Forssmann said, well, we've got various patients who are already dying. Maybe we could do it on one of those. And his boss quite rightly said, no, that would probably be even more unethical. Let's not do that. So Forssmann said, okay, I understand that you don't want me to do this on any patients. Would it be okay if I did it on myself? And his boss said, absolutely not. If I hear of you doing anything like this, you will lose your job straight away. Forssmann, like all good scientists, was tenacious and not a man to listen to authority figures. And so he went away and he worked out that all he actually needed to perform this operation was basically some sterile equipment. He needed a sterile tube to put in the artery to push a tube up to his heart. And he needed sterile equipment in order to make an incision in which to put the tube. The sterile equipment of the hospital was kept in the hospital's operating theatre. And so he figured that actually what he really needed was a key to the operating theatre. And he knew who had a key to the operating theatre. It was a nurse, the chief nurse, a woman called Gerda Ditzen. So he went up to Gerda Ditzen and he asked her out on a date. And he said, would you like to come and have dinner with me? And she said yes. You know, it's an age-old story, nurses and doctors. And as they started having dinner together on a regular basis, Forssmann actually really being quite duplicitous in his intentions, they got to know each other and they were chatting, and it turned out that Gerda Ditzen actually didn't want to stay a nurse. She wanted to become a doctor. And so he started lending her textbooks and encouraging her to read and saying, oh, you should study this and study that. And I think after a few of these dates, Gerda Ditzen started to fall for Werner Forssmann. And when he realized that he had Gerda Ditzen in the palm of his hand, he said, well, do you know what? There's some interesting things still to be done in medicine. And one of them is this experiment that I'd really like to try. It involves introducing a catheter to the human heart. And Gerda Ditzen said, oh, that's absolutely fascinating. Why don't you do it on me? And so Werner Forssmann said, okay. And they went into the hospital's operating theater at night. She had a key so they could get in. She lay down on the operating table. He strapped her down, put some iodine on her arm where he was going to make the incision, and then he said, hold on a minute, I've just got a couple of more things I want to go and get and sort out. And he went into another part of the operating theater where she couldn't see him, and he performed an incision on his arm, and he got the tube that was sterile, and he started pushing it into his artery, and he pushed it all the way up until he was fairly sure that the end of the tube was inside his heart. He'd kind of measured the length of it. Apparently, it produced quite a burning sensation. It wasn't at all pleasant, and he felt a little bit dizzy at this point. At this point, once he realized that he'd done what he set out to do, he went back to Gerda Ditzen, who was still strapped to the table. She took one look at him, saw what he'd done, and was livid. She was furious with him for deceiving her. You'd have thought she'd be quite relieved, but no. So anyway, it was okay because she was strapped to the table, so she couldn't do anything. So once he had calmed her down, he actually unstrapped her and said, do you know what, I'm going to need some help getting downstairs to the X-ray room. We need to take an X-ray of this so we can show that we've done this, and then we can publish the research, and this will be the first catheterization of the human heart, a real landmark in medical research. And so she helped him down. So they got down to the X-ray room, and they went and they started trying to set up an X-ray to take the picture. And the X-ray technician was there, and he saw what was happening, and he thought, I want no part of this. So he ran out of the room and went and got his boss. While he was gone, they thought, well, we'll press ahead and we'll set up the X-ray as best we can. And just as they got to the point where they could almost take the picture, the chief X-ray technician came back into the room. So it ran back into the room and came in and said, there's no way you're doing this. There's no way that you're taking this picture on my watch. This will be my responsibility. I won't have it. And he started yanking at the tube and pulling it out of Werner Forssmann's arm. I always love the reaction to that. You're in the room with Werner Forssmann. Werner Forssmann thought, well, there's no way I've gone to all this trouble just to have some X-ray technician tell me what I can and can't do. So he started kicking the guy's shins. And eventually, after a few kicks on the shins, the X-ray technician decided that he couldn't be bothered to put up with that kind of pain. And he said, fine, just go on, take the picture. I'm not here. You've never seen me. It's nothing to do with me. And so they did. And they took the picture, and they had an X-ray of a tube going into Werner Forssmann's heart. And he took this picture to his boss, the boss who told him under no circumstances was he to do this experiment. And his boss's reaction was, this is fantastic. It will put our hospital on the map. This is amazing. I'm so glad you did this. We must publish this. We must also lie about how we got this picture. So they published this piece of research, and in the paper, when they presented the picture of a catheterization of the human heart, they made up some stuff about how it had been done by a team of researchers, all of whom had been consenting on this, and basically committed some kinds of, or several kinds of research fraud in order to get this published. 10 years later, Werner Forssmann won a Nobel Prize for this very work. And this is the means by which millions of people have their hearts catheterized every year now. And he started the process of being able to save people's lives by delivering drugs to the human heart. It's my favorite story because basically it involves a whole load of very bad behavior, fighting, fraud, deceit, and of course, just downright disobeying authority. All of which are very good characteristics if you want to be a successful scientist. So if any of you are really kind of looking to move into science, don't believe that the stories about what scientists are like. I'm going to start to talk to you about what scientists are really like. So that's Werner Forssmann. This is an interesting man, a man called Kary Mullis, who came up with something called the polymerase chain reaction. The polymerase chain reaction is a way of copying DNA. This is what happens with police forensics when they want to make take a DNA fingerprint and find out who committed the crime. So you need to find a way to copy the DNA quickly and efficiently. And Kary Mullis kind of dedicated several years of his life to trying to work out how to do this. He was working for a biotech company at the time. And he decided that the only way he could really understand how you would sort of take apart the strands of DNA and put them back together in a way that would mean it would start to copy itself was if he could visualize what it was like to be down there on the molecule. And the way that he did that, or the best way he decided to do that, was to learn visualization techniques while taking LSD. It's an unorthodox approach and not one that I necessarily recommend. But this is what he did. And so he said he trained his brain to kind of visualize what it was like to be down there on the molecule. And when he would use these drugs, he would kind of just focus his mind and try and picture the DNA. And he would get into a state where he could sort of almost be down there playing with the molecule when he was on these trips and pulling it apart and putting it back together again. He didn't tell anyone this, of course. All he told them was, I've worked out a way to do copying of DNA very quickly and efficiently. And he told his bosses that he could do it, and he showed them how to do it. And a few years later, he won the Nobel Prize for chemistry for the ability to copy DNA. And after he'd won the Nobel Prize, he came out and said how he did it. So here's tip number 2. If you do things like this, don't talk about it until after you've got the prize. But he said, very interestingly, he said, what if I had not taken LSD ever? Would I have still invented PCR? I don't know. I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. So we don't normally associate scientists with these kinds of behaviors, certainly not this kind of drug taking. But actually, there was a survey in the journal Nature a few years ago where they asked people anonymously to say, did they ever use any illegal drugs during the process of doing their research? And 33% of the respondents said they did, which was quite astonishing. Here's a man who actually was quite glad that he took LSD. This is Steve Jobs. And he was one of very, very many working in those communities of Silicon Valley pioneers, the people who pioneered graphical interfaces for computers and the new ways of displaying information on computers, the new ways of interacting with computers. And actually, there was a huge culture of people who would take psychedelic drugs or other drugs in order to kind of think differently about how you might do something. So Steve Jobs said that taking LSD was one of the 2 or 3 most important things I've done in my life, which is not a statement that we normally associate with somebody at the top of his game in business and in IT. Actually, during that period of the 1970s, Intel employees were given help passing drugs tests by the company because the company's shareholders required that all employees took drugs tests. And the people who were managing the researchers actually knew that none of their employees would pass these drug tests. So they actually had, they had ways of making sure that the employees could get through their drug testing procedures. Scientists display their kind of interesting behavior in other ways as well. And this is Carl Sagan, who was a famous astronomer, astrophysicist. But he was most passionate about science's interaction with humanity and how scientists must be responsible for the science that they bring out to the public. And at one point, Carl Sagan was getting extremely upset with Ronald Reagan, who was stockpiling and continuing to stockpile and test nuclear warheads at a time when actually Gorbachev had stopped stockpiling weapons and had stopped his tests, but Reagan was still continuing with this proliferation. And so Sagan decided to first of all try to enlist the help of his colleagues. And this is a subject we'll maybe get onto a bit later. His colleagues weren't interested in joining any anti-nuclear protests. Many of them had actually been involved in the Manhattan Project and the creation of the atomic bomb, and they thought it was a fairly good thing. But Sagan did a study where he worked out the effects of a nuclear winter and the detonation of all these warheads, and realized that it would decimate the population of the Earth, that it would cause a nuclear winter that would last for years, the harvests would fail for years. And he said this is a serious thing, and we mustn't use our science or allow our science to be used in ways that could be, so detrimental to humanity. So he published this paper in the journal Science, probably the most prestigious journal in existence. And still, his colleagues refused to accept any responsibility for getting involved with stopping the nuclear proliferation. In fact, they actively tried to shut him up, and they wanted nothing to do with his kind of campaign, which they saw as being political and nothing to do with what they were doing with their work. And so Carl Sagan decided that his reputation didn't matter to him at all. And what he really cared about was making sure that people started to listen to those who were campaigning against nuclear weapons. And so Carl Sagan went down to the Nevada test site where the US were testing their nuclear weapons. And he went down on a day when he knew, or the day before, he knew there was a scheduled test meant to happen. And he actually got involved with all all the protesters who were there and led the charge over the fence into the nuclear testing site. So Carl Sagan was there, climbed the fence, ran into the testing site and got himself arrested, got himself a nice criminal record. But that's how much he cared about these kinds of things. And we rarely hear about scientists being passionate about human issues. But Sagan, as well as being a great communicator of science, was an incredibly responsible person who decided that it was more important to be a human being than to be a scientist. And then you get people like this. Note the crazy hair. I wonder where the kids get their ideas from. So, all of you probably associate E equals mc squared with Albert Einstein. This is an equation that he kind of took ownership of. The interesting thing is, he actually published 8 proofs of this equation, mathematical proofs, and not one of them was correct. He fudged them all. It's somewhat to his shame, but he wasn't actually a very great mathematician, it has to be said. And the worst thing for him was that other people had published proofs that were very good proofs, and that were rigorous proofs. But he continued to kind of fudge these issues. So on one paper, he, for instance, made an assumption that he knew was a wrong assumption, that you can treat things that are moving very fast, close to the speed of light, mathematically in exactly the same way as things that are moving slowly. And every sort of physicist worth their salt knows that this isn't an assumption you can make. In another attempt that he made to make this proof, he actually started to admit that he wasn't very good at this. And so one of these proofs has a footnote in which he makes a statement, and then the footnote leads to the reference leads to a footnote which says, of course, this isn't rigorous really, but we'll carry on anyway. And so over the years, he sort of published these 8 proofs, none of which were right. But in the end, he managed to convince everyone that this was his equation. So much so that when somebody did publish a different kind of proof that was correct and was mathematically rigorous, he asked them to kind of cease and desist and wrote them a letter saying, of course, this is my equation, I have priority over this. Einstein's status was so high that people did kind of back off when Einstein had a go at you, and you just kind of let him do what he wanted to do. But interestingly, by the end of his life, he kind of admitted tacitly that he hadn't done a very good job with this and had kind of fudged it. The reason we know this is because he wrote a thing called autobiographical notes 10 years before his death, where he went through all of his discoveries in science, and all his contributions to science were written down. And the one contribution to science that he didn't include in his autobiography was E equals mc squared, so you won't find it anywhere. So he kind of tacitly relinquished his right to that equation. But he was very, very good at sort of fudging things through and getting them published. He also didn't like peer review at all, I have to say, and objected to other people commenting on his work before it was published. Sometimes scientists are actually, I'm sorry to say, quite nasty. And can be quite nasty. And this is a case where Arthur Eddington, on the left, who was at the time in the 1930s, he was a Cambridge astronomer. He was probably the most powerful astronomer in Europe in terms of how deferential all his colleagues were to him. Subrahmanyan Chandrasekhar arrived in England in 1935 to take up a scholarship that he'd won to Trinity College in Cambridge. And he was a very gifted scientist. But on the boat on the way over to England, he worked out what would happen if a star of a certain size collapsed in on itself. Once it got to the end of its life, its gravitational pull on itself would cause it to collapse inwards. And he did the maths, and he worked it all out. And he worked out that actually that collapse would be never-ending, and it would continue until all of the mass was so concentrated in one small point that it would rip a hole in the fabric of space and time. And this is what we now know as a black hole. It took him about 10 minutes to do this calculation, sort of roughly, on the back of an envelope while he was on the ship. And when he arrived in Cambridge, he told Eddington about this. And Eddington, for some reason that nobody has really yet made sense of, took against it and just didn't like the idea at all. And he didn't tell Chandrasekhar that he didn't like the idea at all. What he did was, he said, why don't you present this at the meeting of the Royal Astronomical Society in March next year? It's 4 months away. I'll give you all the calculating equipment you need in order to be able to do all the calculations, to do them rigorously. And I'll put you on the bill, and you can present this result of yours. So that's what Eddington did. He gave him all the calculating equipment, which is actually quite expensive at the time. And Chandra thought he was in a very good position with the most senior astronomer in Europe, basically telling him that he was onto a good thing and that he should have all this equipment and do all this work. And Eddington would come up to his rooms every now and then and ask how you're getting on and how you're proving this bit, and ask to look through all his work and sort of get to know what Chandra was doing. So it got to March 1936 and the meeting of the Royal Astronomical Society. And the day before Chandra was due to speak, the administrator of the conference came up to him and said, I don't know if you know this, but Arthur Eddington has just put himself on the bill immediately after your talk. And sort of gave him the impression that this was something he should be concerned about. Chandra realized that this was something he should be concerned about, but there was nothing he could do at this point. So he went up, gave his talk about the formation of black holes from collapsing stars of a certain size, and then sat down again. And as soon as he sat down, Arthur Eddington stood up to give his talk. And the first thing he said was, everything you've just heard is complete rubbish. And he stood up and he basically spent 20 minutes demolishing Chandra's reputation, without touching the mathematics, because actually the mathematics was right, there was nothing he could pull apart. But he just said, this is stellar buffoonery, it was his phrase. How can a star just disappear to nothing? How can there be a hole in space-time? This is absolutely ridiculous. If nature behaves this way, then we need to stop nature doing this kind of thing. And then he would continue to do this. So he did it for 20 minutes. Unfortunately for Chandra, Eddington was a really good orator and really good speaker, and he was funny. And actually, he had the audience in stitches. And within a few minutes, they were laughing at Chandra and laughing at Chandra's idea. And Chandra said at that moment, he decided that he wasn't going to try and become a top scientist anymore. He decided that he would settle for becoming a second-tier scientist, the kind of person who gives ideas to other people who then go on and publish them. And he gave up all his ambitions at that moment because of the way Eddington had just ridiculed him. And he realized that actually he was an outsider, and he was a man who was an insider who wasn't going to let him in, and he just gave up. Chandra eventually won the Nobel Prize for this very paper that he presented, for this discovery of black holes, but he didn't get it until after Arthur Eddington had died, which is why Max Planck once said that science proceeds one funeral at a time. So that's a terrible story. This is quite a funny story in many ways. So this is Galileo, and we all know the story of how Galileo proved that the Earth goes around the sun. What's much less told these days is what Galileo thought the proof was. And so Galileo said to the Pope that, he said, I have a proof that the Earth goes around the sun. And quite often the Pope is sort of painted as this terrible caricature in this situation. But actually the Pope was quite open to discussing this. And what the Pope said to him was, well, let's see your proof, let's hear your proof, will you write it down? And Galileo said, yes, I'll write it down. I will write it down in a book called A Dialogue Concerning the Tides. And Galileo's proof that the Earth was going around the sun, the best proof in his mind was the fact that there would be sloshing. So if you can imagine this as the Earth going around the sun, you can see that there is sloshing. So this is the Earth going around the sun, and there's definitely sloshing going on, isn't there? And also the Earth is spinning on its own axis, and that causes sloshing as well. And this was Galileo's argument. And he said, this is good proof. And he did all the maths to show exactly how the water would slosh. backwards and forwards. And he came up with the tides coming in and out very nicely. And this for him was the best proof. The Pope interestingly said to him, well, I think it's a bit bigger than just the tides, and suggested that the book be called A Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief Systems of the World, meaning science versus religion, giving it a much more grandiose feel than just this is a book about the tides. And so it seems that the Pope was quite interested in having this debate. So in the end, Galileo offered 3 different proofs, and the third proof, his third chapter in A Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief Systems of the World, was this dialogue on the tides. And he said, this is the best proof I have of all. And he said, and he went through the mathematics of why the water would slosh back and forth on the Earth. He'd have done probably a little bit better if he hadn't been living in Venice, because his mathematics gave him 1 high tide per day. And unfortunately, everyone around him knew that there were actually 2 high tides a day. They saw them coming in and out. They said, your maths must be wrong. There must be something wrong with what you're doing. And Galileo, at this point, did an Einstein, hundreds of years before Einstein, and sort of said, oh, that doesn't really matter. The point is, I've proved it. And then somebody else pointed out that actually, didn't we already know that the moon causes the tides? And he said, oh, that's just ridiculous. I won't listen to imbeciles who talk about the power of the moon. And continued until his death to say that this was the best way of showing that the Earth goes around the sun. Interestingly, there was a new edition of his book released, I think, in the year 2000. And Stephen Hawking wrote the foreword for this book. And he said, of course, the proof is wrong. He said, but we should forgive Galileo because his heart was in the right place. And that's kind of how science works as well, in that you can kind of bluff and fudge and commit a little bit of fraud, but if your heart's in the right place, your colleagues tend to forgive you. And of course, we know he was ultimately right, if for the wrong reasons. Then you get the rebellious scientists. So Crick and Watson were trying to work out the structure of DNA, and they were getting stuck. And they also knew that Linus Pauling over in the US was getting close, or so they thought. He was getting close to getting the structure of the DNA. And they didn't want to have put in all this work only to be beaten to the punch. And so they started accelerating their progress. One of the difficulties they had was that actually their bosses at Cambridge had told them to stop work on DNA, on the structure of DNA, because it was going nowhere. So what they actually had to do was pretend to be working on other things while actually carrying on their research, in the same way that Werner Forssmann wouldn't let his boss know that he was defying his authority. So this is a kind of universal trait of scientists, is that you don't really listen to authority figures if you can possibly avoid it. So Crick and Watson were looking for ways in which to work out the structure of DNA. And what they couldn't do was make the final hurdle. They couldn't see what that structure would be. Which is where a man called Maurice Wilkins came in. Maurice Wilkins was working at King's College in London. And a woman who was working with him, called Rosalind Franklin, had done X-ray crystallography pictures that was showing there seemed to be a helical structure, a double helix. But she wasn't really quite sure that she'd got her pictures quite right, and she wanted to check them, and she wanted to redo her stuff and redo her experiments, and just be sure that it was right before she passed it on. What she didn't know was that Maurice Wilkins, her boss, ostensibly, who actually hated her, and she hated him, and they didn't get on well at all, was taking copies of her pictures and putting them in his office. And he actually stole these copies, stole her research, effectively, in ways that would be considered completely unacceptable today. And then when Crick and Watson heard that there were these pictures around, they asked if they could have them. And Maurice Wilkins handed them over, and from those pictures and from their previous work, Crick and Watson worked out that DNA is a double helix. They published their work with Maurice Wilkins, but not Rosalind Franklin. And they won the Nobel Prize with Maurice Wilkins, but not Rosalind Franklin. And many, many years later, Crick actually said that he kind of apologized for what he called the burglary of the data. But he said that Rosalind Franklin really didn't have what it took to be a top-tier scientist because she wasn't prepared to cut corners like he was. So, and bringing things right up to date. This is a man who works in the UK at the University of Nottingham. His name is David Pritchard. And he was on a trip to Papua New Guinea a few years ago when he heard tell of people who had severe hookworm infections were far less susceptible to allergic reactions, so they didn't have allergies like asthma or eczema. And he put two and two together and thought, well, maybe this is an interesting way of curing these kinds of allergies, which are certainly a bigger problem in the West. And so he decided that hookworms might be the key to reducing infection. So reducing allergies. So he decided that he would infect himself with hookworms. So he was in Papua New Guinea, and he got himself a sticking plaster and put about, I think it was 25 hookworm larvae onto the plaster, and then applied it to his forearm. What they do, these larvae excrete an enzyme which breaks down your skin, and then they can burrow in. And they burrow in through your veins, and they end up basically coming through into your lungs, and then they come up your windpipe, and then they drop down into your stomach. And there they set up home very nicely. And actually, if the infection is not too terrible, then actually they live a very comfortable life inside of you, and you don't really notice they're there. However, some advice from David Pritchard, he says 25 is far too many. So he got quite a severe reaction to 25. But this didn't put him off at all, because he thought he was onto something. His thesis was that these hookworms, in order to survive inside you without triggering a terrible response, must do something to your immune system to dial down the reaction that you might get as a result of their presence. And so that's why perhaps you also didn't react to other allergens in your environment. That's why you didn't maybe have asthma so badly or at all. So he has set up a research program now where he infects people with the hookworm larvae. Only 12, apparently, that's the optimal number. And you have an infection. And there are lots of people around Nottingham in the UK who are now taking part in clinical trials of this research. And it looks like it may well be a good cure, or a good treatment, I should say, for not only asthma and eczema, but also MS, multiple sclerosis, and Crohn's disease as well. And all these are to do with sort of overreactions of the immune system. And so there are clinical trials ongoing at the moment. This self-experimentation is fine. The problem that they had was they couldn't get enough hookworm larvae. So they had to keep going back to Papua New Guinea. And they started off by collecting them in jars and then trying to get them through customs. But they got so fed up with the customs officials who would say, what are in these jars? Why do you want them? And they would end up held up for hours in customs. And they suddenly realized that actually they didn't need to do this at all. All they needed was for one of them to get themselves properly infected, and then they could just walk straight through customs without any of this hold-up. So David Pritchard, being a sensible man, got his colleague to do this. So his colleague, a man called David Brown, now carries a permanent infection of hookworm larvae for their research. And every time they need new samples, he just disappears off to the toilet, and I don't need to go through the rest. So this is the kind of thing that scientists do. This is the kind of interesting lives that you can lead as a scientist. You don't have to be the kind of straight, boring, dull person that most people seem to think scientists are. Why don't we know this? Well, this is an answer you get when you ask the children to draw another scientist. So you said to the children, draw a scientist, okay? And then you say to them, okay, thanks for that, you wild, crazy-haired, bespectacled man with odd facial hair. Thanks for that. Put that to one side. Then you say to the children, draw me another scientist, a different scientist. And what happens when you do this is you get the crazy scientist who's doing dangerous things. So underneath that level of the straight, boring, dull weirdo, what you have, the next stage of scientists or appreciator of scientists is these people who are doing dangerous things. So this is, I think, a Norwegian one in the top corner over here. Danger, crazy research going on. This is a scientist at work. Here at the bottom, we have a scientist who's about to do something unspeakable to some poor Frankenstein's monster here on the operating bed. And here's another scientist, this is from a different culture, just about to do something terrible to some poor defenseless animal. And this is primary school children's conception of science. Where do they get this from? This is extraordinary. But we have this innate perception, or it's not quite innate, it's learned through the culture, that scientists are, under the surface, dangerous people. Here's an interesting thing. if we look for where this came from, in 1956, Jacob Bronowski said, people hate science. And he was a scientist, a geneticist. He said, people hate science. There's no use beating about the bush here. Actually, as somebody in the UK, that's actually a very shocking statement now, because people generally love science, I would say. People are quite fond of watching science programs on the TV. The idea that, that 50 years ago, or a little more, that people hate science, that you could say that as a general thing, was quite extraordinary. But there's a reason why he said that. And the reason he said that is because the years in the post-war period, people had grown a real fear of science. People including somebody like Winston Churchill, who said the Stone Age may return on the gleaming wings of science. It's arguable whether the human race have been gainers by the march of science beyond the steam engine. Give me the horse. The reason why there was this anti-science sentiment is because the Second World War had actually given people good reason to fear scientists. There had been the Nazi concentration camps, the Japanese experiments on prisoners of war. The Allies had developed chemical weapons and even tried them out on their own soldiers. We had the V2 rockets that were raining down from Germany on London, made a big difference to the British perception of science. And all of these technologies, and of course the atomic bomb, all of these technologies were perceived as being the result of science. And at this time in our civilization's history, science was dangerous, but science was also being funded enormously by governments, because every government knew that whoever had the best scientists would win the next war. So we have this period of history where actually people were really quite scared of science and quite distrustful of science. People had a big problem with science. There's a very interesting exchange of memos between the Royal Society of London, which is a big sort of scientific institution at this time, probably the biggest scientific institution in the world in many ways, and the BBC. And the Royal Society was writing to the BBC saying, why are you producing all these programs about the perils and dilemmas of science and how science is going to be awful, it's going to kill all of us in the end? And the BBC would write back and say, well, because we're genuinely concerned, and this is what our reporters want to report on, what a scientist is going to do next. People don't trust science. And so the Royal Society would write back and say, well, why can't you write about how science is going to cure disease and how science is going to rid the world of insects so that we can all live without malaria or any other tropical diseases, how science is going to feed the world and create food for everyone so that no one in the world goes hungry. And the BBC wasn't really terribly interested in doing that kind of journalism, because they were interested in what actually the people's perception was that science was dangerous. And so what the Royal Society did in response was to say, okay, we can help you make science documentaries. And remember, TV is sort of coming online during this period. We can help you make science programs for TV and radio, but we will tell you which scientists you can use and which scientists you can't. So they offered help in kind of putting across how they wanted science to be perceived. And so they had a banned list of certain scientists that they wouldn't allow to appear on TV. And other scientists were encouraged to take up this role of helping the BBC. And by that way, they kind of steered the PR image of science. And this is the kind of result that we've got now, where we actually have a very positive image in some ways. The trouble was, with all this kind of perception of science as being a problem, scientists tended to react to it by becoming subservient and saying, like the Royal Society saying, we're going to make the world a better place, we're here for your service, we're here to help. And scientists were terribly afraid of being seen as being a problem. Bronowski summed it up by saying, the scientists become the monk of our age, timid, thwarted, anxious to be asked to help. And this is in many ways the kind of image of the scientists that we have today, as these people who are kind of not quite normal. They're a bit weird, they're a bit sort of distant, they keep themselves to themselves, and they sort of talk about science being something useful, but they sort of almost made themselves slightly unhuman. Does this matter? Well, I think it does. One of the important things that we need science to do in this day and age is really to be moving us forward in certain things that we are having to face. We're having to face climate change. In the past, we had to face the role of CFCs in destroying the ozone layer. And all of these things, and we have to provide enough energy for the growing global population. There are water shortages across the world that need solutions. And all of these things actually need a generation of scientists to be raised up who will be the kinds of scientists who can create answers and solutions. And it turns out that if you have the kind of scientists that our generation currently perceives as being not quite normal and not quite human and a bit weird and crazy and somewhat dangerous as well, then you don't get the right kind of personalities coming into science all the time. So science created itself this kind of brand, if you like, brand science. It's safe, it's trustworthy, it's a route to a better life, all these things. Disciplined. Scientists will tell you that everything is objective, that everything they do is logical, there's no bias, it's objective, it's impersonal. It's always grounded in experimental results. This is brand science. This is how we perceive science. The trouble is, you can read that slightly differently, and if you read it acrostically down the front, you kind of have staid, dull, and boring. And you have this kind of sense that science is not quite anything that anybody wants to get involved in. The scientists are quite often perceived as the dull people. At the dinner party, you don't want to be sat next to the scientist. You want to sit next to the sculptor or the artist or the writer, the novelist. These are the people that we want to deal with. We don't want to have to deal with scientists. They're a bit weird. Let me show you where I think scientists fit. This is my favorite graph in the whole of science. This is a graph that shows you basically why we don't like zombies. Unfortunately, zombies have just come off the bottom there. I'm just going to show you. This, you can almost read it. This says zombie. So the solid line is, as you go across, this is likeness to a human being, okay? So on the right-hand side, it's very like a human being. On the left-hand side, not very like a human being, okay? So let's take the solid line, which are the things that stay still. And as you follow it, as things get more like a human being, we kind of like them. You know, dolls, toys, children's toys, they get a bit more like a human being. And that kind of peaks with stuffed animals or you know, these kind of children's toys. And we quite like them. But once they start getting too like a human being, this likeness is too close, we don't like it as much. And that falls off down to the bottom. And there at the bottom of the curve is a corpse. We really don't like corpses. Well, I don't. I can't speak for you. And corpses which lie still and they look like human beings, but we know that they're not human beings. There's something different about them. That's kind of, that's the bottom. We really don't like that. If you get even more like a human being, then obviously a real human being, it's fine. So what about the dashed line is things that move. So again, industrial robots, well, they don't look very like a human being. We don't feel any affinity to them. Once they get to a humanoid robot, and I'm sure you'll have seen video footage of these humanoid robots, they're actually quite cute and quite engaging, and we quite like them, okay? But they're not allowed to get too like human beings, because if they're too like a human being, the likeness is too strong, and they move around, they're effectively like zombies. And we really don't like zombies. We like zombies even less than we like corpses. You can see the line drops much further down. Now, the interesting thing is that this sort of place where everything drops down is called Uncanny Valley. And the reason it's called Uncanny Valley is because we feel that these people or these images or whatever we have, we don't like them. They feel wrong. We're not comfortable with them. And Hollywood is very well aware of this problem. And so sometimes it makes a mistake. I don't know if any of you have seen this, a film called The Polar Express with Tom Hanks in. And he was a very lifelike animation. And it was like you were looking at Tom Hanks, but it wasn't quite Tom Hanks, and there was something quite weird about the whole thing. Here's what a reviewer had to say about this. Those human characters in the film come across as downright, well, creepy. So The Polar Express is at best disconcerting, and at worst, a wee bit horrifying. And if any of you have seen the film, I hope you'll share my sentiment with it, certainly. I gave this talk once, and somebody suddenly went, oh. And they said, afterwards they said to me, I took my son to see this film and he just screamed all the way through it and I never understood why. He said, now I understand. So my argument would be, really, I would say that scientists have unwittingly, by their kind of reaction to being hated after the Second World War, they've unwittingly tried to be sort of so subservient and so logical and so trustworthy. They've kind of put themselves actually into the not quite human category. And they've made themselves a little bit uncanny. And this has had some distinct consequences. So this is a piece of research by a woman called Hanke Kopelschenk, who's at the University of Groningen. And she did a piece of research showing that the more children are socialized, the more they get on well with their peers, the more they're able to interact, the more likely they are to drop science as soon as they're able to drop it. That's quite a worrying thing. So all these gifted, socialized children are actually going and choosing to do the humanities. They're choosing to become lawyers and writers, and they're doing English degrees. They're becoming politicians. They're not becoming scientists. That's bad, because actually we want scientists who are good at collaborating, good at being social beings. Science is all about good collaboration these days. So that's a problem. And this is a report from the Times. Children shun science careers because of the geek image. You can trace this idea back to them not being quite normal. Children are being put off careers in science because of a widespread perception that scientists must be eccentrics. And so children who consider themselves normal human beings actually think science isn't for me. And that's a big problem. The other big problem that I have with this kind of overemphasis on not being human is that we get this distrust. And this distrust is almost like a zombie, effectively. We think of scientists in the same way we might think of zombies. So when they're building the Large Hadron Collider, or when they're creating genetically modified organisms, GM crops, when they're sort of advocating nuclear power, we don't quite trust their motives, and there's a problem with the public perception of whether we really want the scientists to be doing all this, because deep down, somewhere, we're like those children who drew those pictures of scientists doing crazy, dangerous things. And there's this perception that actually scientists aren't to be trusted, for all their kind of protesting that they are to be trusted. And so we end up with a distorted view of science's aim. And actually, so we can't enter into a normal, rational discussion about many of these things. And GM crops is certainly one that in the UK, there is no normal, rational discussion going on. It is impossible to have a conversation about GM crops because people are in entrenched positions and nobody trusts the scientists, and the scientists don't know how to be trusted. And then you have a problem with scientists getting a distorted view of their role. So many of the post-war science generation took on this full, this full role of saying science is going to make the world a much better place. And they kind of didn't stop to think in many ways about what they were doing and whether they knew all the answers and whether they should proceed. So in some ways you could argue that the public were right to distrust them. This quote comes from a chemist called Robert White Stevens. He said, "The modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes man is steadily controlling nature." And actually that was in response to a book that was written by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, which had shown that a lot of the pesticide use after the Second World War in America was actually causing enormous problems and killing lots of wildlife. And she wrote this book, Silent Spring, as a response saying, actually, if we don't stop this pesticide use, particularly DDT, then actually we're going to wake up one day and there'll be no more birds. There'll be no birdsong. There'll be a silent spring. And Robert White Stevens was one of the many people in the chemical industry who said this is absolute rubbish and we will use our chemicals and our new understanding of chemistry to be able to take control of nature. And there's amazing footage. I encourage you to go on YouTube if you can find it. The amazing footage of trucks, tanker trucks, going around the streets in the United States in the post-war years, spraying DDT over all the public areas. And there's this amazing scene where there are kids in a swimming pool, at a swimming pool, sitting on the edge of the pool, eating sandwiches, being sprayed with DDT in a public service that came from post-war science. So sometimes scientists do get it wrong, and they need to have a more humble view of themselves and have a certain amount of caution. So I think there are good reasons to kind of address this view of science and who we think scientists are, and also for scientists to take on some questions about who they think they are, and maybe they redefine their role. And really it comes down to interacting again with the public. So not taking on this role of being in an ivory tower or being distinct, but actually seeing themselves as part of humanity. One of the problems has been the compliance of science in many ways. We've had all these problems that we needed to deal with, and many scientists, and Sherwood Rowland is one of them. Sherwood Rowland effectively fought a one-man fight against CFCs when the ozone layer was being depleted. He'd done the science, he knew what was happening. None of his colleagues wanted to talk to him because he was going out in public and saying CFCs are bad, there should be a ban. And all of his colleagues said, this is politics, it's nothing to do with us. All we should do is report the science. And Sherwood Rowland's response was, what's the use of having developed the science well enough to make predictions if, in the end, all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for them to come true? Sherwood Rowland speaking from the grave. Carl Sagan said, it is the particular task of scientists, I believe, to alert the public to possible dangers, especially those emanating from science or foreseeable through the use of science. And he was a good example of somebody who did this and got into a lot of trouble with his colleagues because of it. And then James Hansen put it very simply. I'm almost done, so I'm just going to shout now. James Hansen. Inaction over climate change, given that it had the science and it knew what was going on. And he said simply of his fellow scientists, do we not know enough to say more? And all of his fellow scientists really were silent. And Hansen is one of the few that now goes out and campaigns and gets involved. And really, I think, takes on his role as a citizen and a human being and an informed citizen, as all scientists should be. So there's no excuse for not communicating your science. And I think it's really important for scientists to get out and communicate with the public and show really people who are paying for their research that it's good, that this is what we're using it for, this is how we're making progress. Equally, that will enable the public to then come out and start to sort of get more involved and interested in science rather than seeing it as something uncanny and weird. And maybe even encouraging their children to become scientists rather than lawyers, because the world doesn't need any more lawyers. And I'm going to stop there, having won that fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for this presentation. Actually, the majority of you know that we face the same problems with the science communication. And such lectures as yours and many others should be not only during book fairs in Vilnius, in Lithuania, but during, I think, regularly during school year. Contrary to those who were just probably watching web broadcast, you in the audience may have chance to ask maybe one or two questions. So please, you may ask in Lithuanian, we may maybe translate.
We have a translator here.
Yeah, we have a translator here, by the way.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So please, just, you have a chance to, yes, please.
Well, do you think the onset of sort of Facebooking, this new type of media that is accessible to everyone, I mean in particular groups that are about science and are joined by lots of people every day, and there is this one Facebook group, I effing love science. Most people, I don't know, most people around me are actually joining this group. Do you think this doesn't raise awareness of science as not just an inhumane sort of uncanny valley thing? Is it not a shift in, well, a modern time shift that will have to wait out?
I think there is a shift, and I think social media is making a difference. Social media, for instance, allows scientists to communicate directly with whoever's listening. So you can be on Twitter and say, I've just published this paper, I've just written a blog about what it's about, and suddenly you have these multiple outlets. I know lots of research groups now that have their own Facebook pages. So all the members of the research group are on Facebook. They sort of put their research onto these pages, and then they invite others to come and have a look. So in a way, they're reaching out to their own social network through their things. So there is definitely a shift with this media. And I think the wonderful thing is for scientists is that it means that you don't have to worry about a journalist necessarily distorting your stories, or you don't have to worry about them leaving out the bit that you wanted left in. But you can take control. So lots of scientists have started blogging now, and they blog about their research papers. Some of them blog anonymously about life as a scientist, which is always very entertaining, although they can't identify themselves because they say terrible things about their colleagues. But there's a whole new sort of way of interacting with people, of these interfaces between the sort of widespread community and scientists. And I would just encourage scientists to take hold of them as much as possible, even if that does mean doing myself out of a job.
Far more appealing in the recent years. The geek nerd stereotype is easier on the public.
I would slightly disagree with that. This geek nerd thing, I don't know if it happens here in Lithuania. There's this subculture, really. It's a subculture of, we self-identify as people who are interested in maths and numbers and science and all things really complicated. The problem is with that kind of subculture is it can be exclusive rather than inclusive. So what happens is we self-identify as this group, and if you're not like us, then you're not in our club, and I'm not very comfortable with that. So I don't self-identify as a geek or a nerd, because actually I'm not that into maths, really. I quite like reading novels and being a normal human being. And I think once you start self-identifying in a certain way, it can be very detrimental, and you start to do things that maybe you wouldn't normally do, or you hang around in groups of people that you wouldn't normally hang around with. I think it can be a little bit divisive, really, is my view on that.
For the presentation, I think you showed that a scientist must take a lot of responsibility for his work. And I have a question about where should we start in changing an image of scientists? I mean that you said that there is no role models for those young persons who are really socially active, not geeks, and etc., etc. And a lot of them do not go to the science, and it's a bad thing for science as a whole. So do you think it should be left for a personal initiative of a scientist who must come up with some decisions how to do it, or it should be institutionalized in schools or universities, colleges, to try to change that image and perception in all societies?
That's a really great question, a very important one. The question for those who couldn't hear is who is going to do something about this image that children get of scientists? And the answer is, we can do all of the above. We can do all of those things. But I think the most important thing is that children in school meet scientists, meet real scientists. I think it's as simple as that. There was an amazing project that was carried out at Fermilab in the United States, which is the US's sort of main particle physics facility. And they documented this on the web. I'd encourage you to try and find it. But they took a class of students to meet scientists at Fermilab. But what they did was they did the draw a scientist test before they went. So they asked them to draw a scientist before they went and write a short paragraph description of what a scientist is like. And you got all the usual stereotypes, and you can predict what will come out. And then they asked them to do the same thing afterwards. And you have this whole class of 25 8-year-olds who have had their minds blown by the fact that these scientists are normal human beings. And they do things like play racquetball. And you can read these descriptions and look at the drawings they did. And the drawings they did afterwards were drawings of normal human beings, normal people. There were no lab coats. They were wearing jeans. There were women as well as men. It was amazing. And it's actually quite moving to go and look at this website. Because what you realize is that if you are a scientist, in many ways, the greatest contribution you can make is to just go out and meet a class of school children, because you will change their perception. And act normal, don't act weird. All right.
Aš manau, kad Michaelas mokslininko įvaizdžio keitimą sėkmingai pradėjo Lietuvoje, nes aš jau turiu lietuvišką istoriją.
Okay, so maybe as a translator, I will continue. I think Michael has started the change of the scientist's image in Lithuania, and I have a story.
Vakar mes su juo važiavom taksi iš oro uosto į viešbutį. Ir po to, kai aš nuvedžiau Michaelą į viešbutį, grįžau į tą patį taksi ir taksi vairuotojas man sako, jis visai neatrodo kaip mokslininkas.
Okay, so yesterday when we took a taxi from the airport to the hotel, and when I came back to the taxi, the driver told me, well, this guy doesn't look like a scientist at all.
Jis per daug šypsosi ir per linksmai ir per daug kalba kaip mokslininkas. Žodžiu, viskas tiesa.
When I asked why is that, the driver said, he's smiling a lot and talks a lot.
That's exactly what it is. It's extraordinary that people, the children identify not smiling as a scientist. Thanks for that, that's very helpful.
Yeah, so you should come more often.
You have one taxi driver.
Just take some more taxis.
Okay, I think that we can close now and thank Michael again, and you have a chance tomorrow to visit book fair at the Lit Expo Center, and Mikas Vengris will be moderator, or who will be...
I think Rolandas Maskoliūnas.
Yeah, Rolandas Maskoliūnas will guide the discussion on science communication. So you are welcome tomorrow to visit book fair. It's a chance also to buy books there. So thank you for coming to this evening, to this lecture, and I wish you all the best. And thank you, Michael.